Dan Kamin on the Fishbowl. Welcome.
Hi, Sam.
Great to be talking with you again. Thanks for coming to swim in the bowl with me. Um, I guess first I'd like to ask, what got you interested in film?
Well, I grew up loving film like everybody. I mean, I think the reason that people are finding it so easy in a sense, although not a lot of screenplays get produced compared to how many are written, but everybody who grew up on comic books and movies got the idea that comic books are essentially storyboards, and so we're all kind of film wise. And of course, the prevalence of the ability to make movies, at first with 8 millimeter, and then with video, and now digital, where it's now with our telephones. It just makes it a natural language that almost everybody understands. And I've been particularly inspired by films because they really affected my life a lot. Not only did I grow up enjoying them, but literally they affected what I ended up doing professionally. I saw the film Houdini when I was a young kid with Tony Curtis, and I had to be part of that world. So as soon as the opportunity presented itself, I started finding a way into that world. I started learning how to do magic tricks, and by the time I was 12 years old, I was doing magic shows at birthday parties and things.
Very cool, very cool. Now, you also have an extensive background in slapstick comedy, the knowledge of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, although the famous ones, the classics.
Yes, when I was in college, I went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and at that time, you couldn't see any movie ever made anywhere on any device. At that time, you watched it on the Late Show, and colleges would have film series in which they would show mostly newer films, but also sometimes older films, because mine was a generation that kind of rediscovered the beauty and importance of the cinema legacy. We had a great film series on campus, and what was great about it, it's called Film Arts Society. What was great about it was that every year it would start out from silent films, and it would go to the most hip contemporary films coming out of Europe by Fellini and Bergman and Antonioni. And so in the course of 4 years, everybody did it for entertainment. It was not a class, but in the course of 4 years, you got to see what happened in the 20th century through the eye of the movie, the lens of the camera. So it was a great education. In the middle of that, they would show silent films every year, and so I discovered these people who were then not very current in the culture. Buster Keaton was rediscovered, not just by me, but by everybody of my generation. Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, Laurel and Hardy. We kind of knew Laurel and Hardy because they would show them on television, but they didn't show Harold Lloyd or Buster Keaton on television very much. And Chaplin at that time was persona non grata in the United States because of politics issues and other issues that are another podcast. Um, but when I saw my first silent films, and especially my first Charlie Chaplin film, it simply blew me out of the water. Since we're in the fishbowl here, I'll use the water analogy if you don't mind. Uh, and I wanted to learn how I could be part of that world. And I lucked out because there was a man on campus who was a mime artist, and at that time you didn't even know the word mime. It wasn't current. Um, but as soon as I saw him, I realized. I mean, he was doing shows. He wore white tights and white makeup on his face, and he was doing creating incredible illusions that seemed uncanny. It seemed like magic tricks, but without any secret. And he was creating these. He would do a story about a trial where he played 10 or 11 different people and showed exactly what was happening in this murder trial without saying a word. It was unbelievable, and I realized, connect the dots. That's what had happened to silent movies. They weren't making them in movies anymore, but they were. It was in the form of these people doing this strange, new, very hip, avant-garde thing called mime or silent theater or pantomime. People had different names for it, but all the physical comedy of silent movies was there, a slightly different form of it. He wasn't doing acrobatics. He wasn't falling out of buildings like Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton did, but it was still using motion to tell the story, using your body to tell the story, body language, rather than words. And that was the essential connection between them, and I wanted to know how I could be a part of that world too. Luckily, that guy was teaching on my campus, and I just started pestering him until he finally just said, "Oh, just come to the class."
Awesome. That's fantastic. Now, you also took your mime working skills to the big screen on Diary of a Hitman.
A number of films. The great thing when I got to make some films was that it was full circle for me. My early fascination with movies, which we all share, um, but my particular fascination with aspects of certain kinds of acting, stylized, weird acting, like where you can create illusions, like this mime artist. His name is Jewel Walker. He's still alive. He's 89 years old, and he's in better shape than you and me put together. Um, and so people started approaching me because I started doing mime around. After I graduated from college, I started performing mime on college campuses and wherever I could find it. And I got a reputation, particularly around Pittsburgh, where I still live. And so some people approached me about doing. I got to do some television commercials, some industrial films. Each of them I saw as an experiment, learning this other language. I learned the language of magic. I learned the language of movement, and then I was using them and traditional acting to learn the language of communicating over the medium, which is the same medium, even though the shape of it keeps changing. It's basically pictures in motion.
That's couldn't have said it any better myself. Um,
That's why I had to say it. So
right.
I didn't put you on the spot.
Exactly. I put you on the spot. um, can you talk about your experience working with Robert Downey Jr. on Chaplin, being an expert in slapstick comedy and Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and I guess after that question, we can talk about your experience with Johnny Depp on Benny and June.
Well, sure. I I I, I kept being fascinated with these silent films, especially Chaplin's, which struck me more deeply even than the other ones, although I sort of equally love Harold Lloyd and Keaton and Laurel. They're all great, but something about Chaplin kept me coming back to him. And to me, it was like graduate school. I kept on looking at his films to see if I could fathom their secrets, learn from them. Uh, I wasn't trying to do another Charlie Chaplin film or continue his legacy. I didn't, you can't do that. That
Right.
era is gone. It's like, nobody's the best um, buggy maker in the world is still doing something that's very museum oriented. It's not. They're not. We're driving in cars now, and
Right.
they'll be obsolete as soon as we have hover, discs that we put on our forehead or teleportation. Um, so I realized I didn't want to do what he did, but I wanted to learn from what he did, and I kept looking at those movies, and eventually, just like the way I learned magic, at first by going and looking at books in a library and then finding mentors, but there were no mentors with Chaplin because although my mime teacher gave me a lot of the understanding of the craft of movement, Chaplin was doing a cinematic form of it. And when I read books, of which I read, there are a lot of them, and I read them all, they didn't have what I wanted to know about, which is what's going to help me in my craft. The books were about sort of his interesting rags to riches story and the scandals that plagued him and the politics and the sex. That's all great, but that wasn't what I wanted to know. I wanted to know the secrets of how he was making jokes. They're more than 100 years old, some of them now, because he started making movies in 1914. And some of those jokes he made in 1914 in those movies, a lot of them are still funny now when you see them in the right context. Even looking on YouTube, you can get some of the effect, but you can't really see them in their full effect, their full power, until you see them the way the original audiences saw them on a big movie screen with a bunch of other people sitting around you in the dark and with live music playing. That's the ideal circumstance for seeing one of these films. And then you suddenly see what the fuss was about. And I couldn't do that, and the books weren't giving me that many clues. So I just watched the films. I got copies of the films. They were illegal copies in many cases because they weren't available. So I plunged into the black market and found my own copies. I never used them to make money. I wasn't selling them, but I wanted them for myself. I was finally, after watching them for years, I started to see some of the secrets. I'll give you one example. Chaplin's image is an iconic image, as you know. I mean, one of the reasons he got famous was that anybody, you see, 10 seconds of a Charlie Chaplin film, and you can walk like him, and you can draw him. It's so distinctive. It's as iconic. The only competing image in terms of the power of the graphic uh, uh, visualization of a human being is Mickey Mouse. I mean, that's a powerful image of, although it's an anthropomorphized mouse, and Chaplin is a powerful image of a human being. Um, and I realized one of the reasons you look at him, even if he was very fond of long shots sometimes where the camera's literally probably 400 feet away from him. Uh, and one of the reasons he still can communicate and that you go to him rather than looking at, the other people around him is simply that he painted his face whiter than everybody else around him. And in the middle of that white face is a black mustache. It's like a bullseye. And your eye goes right to the bullseye, no matter what content, and the outer shape of his image. He's got this round bowler hat that recapitulates the mustache, really curly hair that makes his head look even bigger on him than it did. The tight coat and baggy pants. It's sort of like a walrus kind of
Right.
shape, and shoes that are twice as big as his real feet that are usually pointed out to either side. That's why everybody can walk. You can waddle like him, with your feet apart. And so when I started having insights like that, I realized, oh, now I can read the book that I wanted to read about him, but I have to write it first because I'm starting to see the so I did something that was an act of stupidity and folly because who's going to read a book about that when you can read about his sex life? Um, but one of the people who read it was Robert Downey Jr., who called me up when he read it. It just happened that they were making a biopic on Chaplin, and they had chosen Downey, who has a remarkable resemblance to him in certain ways. And Downey got hold of my book, and he realized, oh, this is like the training manual for my role that I'm about to do, which is the hardest role I've ever done because I don't just play sort of something out of the top of my head. I have to play somebody who everybody recognizes. Um, and I have to play him almost as well as he played himself. And he called me up in Pittsburgh and said, um, I think you may be the only person who can help me pull this off. And within 2 weeks, he had come to Pittsburgh, and we began the job of turning him into Charlie Chaplin. He got me hired on the movie, and that's how I got involved with that movie. And Dan, so that's a long answer to your question. How was it working with him? He was absolutely hungry, starved for the information that he needed to turn himself into Charlie Chaplin, because to turn himself into Charlie Chaplin would be like saying, well, Sam Fish, you're going to be in a movie about the greatest Olympic pole vaulter who ever lived. And by the way, there will be no stunt doubles. You're going to be doing the pole vaulting because you couldn't do a stunt double for Chaplin. Chaplin moved in that distinctive. He was probably the most graceful movie actor who's ever lived, and he was graceful all the time. You can see it in newsreel footage, and you can't get a stunt double for that. Robert had to do it all the time, and he understood that. So we began the job of turning him into Charlie Chaplin systematically by looking at one facet of movement and one part of his body. I mean, when he flew into Pittsburgh, the first thing he said to me was, "I want you to tell me how to hold my fork," because Chaplin holds his fork in a different way. Just look at one of his
Right.
movies. Look at the way he eats
Right.
that shoe in the Gold Rush, and twiddles the shoelaces and turns them into spaghetti.
Right.
He doesn't look like a gruff prospector, which is the role he's playing. He suddenly looks like uh, the most upscale diner in history,
Right.
savoring the delicious taste of these boiled shoelaces.
I have to say I think the Gold Rush is one of my top favorite Charlie Chaplin movies. I mean, just the the whole movie is absolutely hysterical. To this day, that's one of the great things about Chaplin is that, like you said, over 100 years later, his comedy is still funny, and that says a lot about comedy in itself. And I just have to say the scene where, in the Gold Rush, where he's being chased by the big scruffy guy who thinks he's like food. What was it, like a chicken or something?
Yeah, I figured you would talk about that because you're into horror films, and The
Right,
Gold Rush is one of the reasons it's funny. When a comedian makes you laugh, he's done his job. But
right,
the Chaplin's films are they're funny, which is that earns you the price of admission. But they're more than funny. That scene, if you recall, it starts with them being snowbound in a cabin. Chaplin was looking at stereo cards.
right.
You know what stereo cards are, Sam?
Yeah,
They were the predecessor, before the ViewMaster. They were the
right.
ViewMaster of the turn of the 20th century. Just a card that you would stick into this in front of this lens, and you get that stereo illusion. It's the same principle as the ViewMaster, and Chaplin was looking at stereo views of the place where the Donner Party got stranded, the in Sierra Nevadas, and he read a book about the Donner Party, and he thought, the Donner Party in the 1840s were pioneers that were going across the country, and they got snowbound and ran out of food, and eventually they ate their moccasins, and eventually eat each other, and some of them survived to tell the grisly tale. And Chaplin heard about this or read about it and thought, what a great idea for a comedy. And the core scene, you know, in that sense of the inspiration of it, is the scene where they're snowbound and starving, and they eat his shoe. First, they eat his shoe, and then his cabin mate Mac is so starving that he looks at him, and there's a dissolve. It's a great classic movie device to show it. He turns into a giant chicken. He's in a giant chicken outfit, and it's funny. But underneath it, that's the film has suddenly become a horror film
Right,
because he's gonna eat his friend. It's like a zombie film,
right, right.
and they go back and forth, and his one of the greatest gags in the film is his friend comes to his senses, and they go back to sleep, uh, but Charlie doesn't trust him. So the next morning, there's this great shot of they have cots at the opposite ends of the cabin, and the Chaplin is covered up, and his feet are poking out. The two shoes are poking out the bottom of the blanket. And all of a sudden, his head comes up between the shoes. He has put his hands in the shoes so he can keep an eye on
Right.
and make sure that he's not going to be attacked and he's not going to become a midnight snack. And it's a great visual gag, but again, underlying it is something real. That's why we
Right.
relate to Chaplin's comedy, or Buster Keaton's, or Lloyd's for that matter. Laurel and Hardy. They're all speaking truth to us. They're all telling us something about the human condition. I mean, under what circumstances, what would it take for you to resort to cannibalism? Probably not really that much.
Right. When you're hungry, you gotta eat. I think it's simple as said. But on Buster Keaton, you had quite an experience working with Johnny Depp on Benny and June, teaching him how to act like Buster Keaton and a few other magic tricks up your sleeve.
Yes, when people were coming up to us when I was working with Downey, coming up to him in Hollywood and saying, "Wow, you're brave," because for an actor to play Chaplin, is that's like for a singer doing a biopic about Pavarotti or Enrico Caruso. I mean, it's daunting. It's a daunting task. But the word got out that he was pulling it off, and the people who were making the producers of Benny and June realized that he had to have somebody working with him, and they tracked me down and and hired me to work with Johnny Depp because they had the script that they had already committed to doing, but the comedy portions in it were weren't they weren't going to be funny as they were originally written, and so I was. They initially asked me to simply stage them for them, and I said no, I can't stage them because they're conceptually they don't fit the character, and they're not gags. This is lost art stuff because we don't have. You went to the movies in 1923, and half of what you see would be comedies, visual, physical comedies, and they certainly all weren't as good as the people were talking about. There were lots of just like there's lots of music out there, and you have your favorites, and some
Right.
and some of them are going to stand the test of time, and some of them won't. But the whole point is there's a whole you're swimming around in a sea of similar fish. To get back to your show theme, once again, give you a free plug. Uh, uh, so, but I sensed I liked the script very much, and I sensed how what Depp would have to do to be credible as somebody who had this peculiar obsession with old movies, and he had the capability of taking being in any situation and finding solutions in the way the silent comedians found solutions to. I mean, they weren't just being funny, they were always just trying to find a solution. And the solution Charlie found to not being eaten by his cabin mate, the solution Buster Keaton found to not being killed by the Southern family who, thinks, who wants to kill him because there's been a feud in the families and he's next. Um, the solution Harold Lloyd found when he finds himself trapped into climbing the side of a skyscraper for a publicity stunt. They're all different solutions, and they emanate from the characters. And I had a sense of how they could emanate from the character whose name, in fact, was Sam, that Johnny Depp was playing in that movie. And so I had really a wonderful meeting where I met with the two producers and the director, and explained how I would approach it, and it ended with my giving them an idea that became the new end of the picture, um, because the picture didn't end originally with Johnny Depp climbing up the side of the building. It just ended with him waving to show June that he was there. He had come to see her. Uh, and I said, well, you really can't have a movie with a character who has this capability and not have him do a silent movie kind of stunt like climbing a building. But it's not a silent movie; it's a contemporary movie, so he should fail. He should fall and hurt himself. And it was really a wonderful, satisfying moment for me because they all looked at each other and turned to me and said, "You're hired." And then, but I wouldn't be hired unless Johnny Depp accepted my working with him because he was the big gorilla in the room, and he came in a little later to meet me and to consent or not to work with me. And so I told him some of the ideas I had, and he was fine with them. And he had he was a chain smoker at the time, and I took his cigarette out of his mouth and pushed it up my nose, and he said, "Whoa, I have to learn how to do that." And so I gave him a task, a quest. I pulled out a silver dollar and rolled it around my fingers and said, "If you can learn to do this, I'll show you all the magic you want." And we ended up using. 2 weeks later, he came back, and he could sort of do it. He could begin to do it, and so magic became our break time, our dessert after he'd worked, because he worked for hours on the routines we did, as did Robert Downey. We just had to rehearse because this is not familiar material to these guys, even though they are both wonderful actors. Um, they were already wonderful actors then. Of course, they were already big, worldwide stars, and have only both become bigger stars since because of the brilliance of their work and hitting upon certain perfect vehicles for them. But as you recall, of course, Depp used that coin roll at the end of the first Pirates movie.
Right, right.
He doesn't actually do it though. He begins to do it, and then it goes into an animation. Because I'm not sure. I wasn't on that shoot, and I don't think he had learned it quite that well. But I know for a fact. I'd swear. And somebody's one of Depp, if you're listening or whatever, and you can call me and correct me. But it had to be his idea. Nobody else would have thought of that of the skeleton. rolling the magical doubloon around, except Depp.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Well, I guess back to horror movies. Um, let's talk about your experience as Old Wooden Chief from George A. Romero's Creepshow 2.
Old Chief Woodenhead.
Old Chief Woodenhead.
Yatta hey, Chief Woodenhead. Um, uh, well, that one happened before all these other ones we're talking about, and the movie was written by George Romero, based on Stephen King's stories, as you know, and the director was Michael Gornick, who was George's cinematographer before. This was his move up to directing, and he knew about me from my work around town. And basically, he just wanted somebody um, sort of skinny that he could build the Indian costume around, and could move in an interesting way, as though a wooden um, statue, a wooden cigar store Indian, basically would become animated and so on. So he wanted somebody skinny who could build the Indian costume around, who could move in an interesting way, like something made of wood that had suddenly become animated, a golem, as it were. And it was an interesting challenge to play a creature, to play a horror movie creature. Because I essentially was blind and deaf in the costume. There were mechanics. I couldn't physically move the mouth and the eyelids, um, and there were motors inside the head to move those things, and of course the eyes. I couldn't see out of it, so I was blind, and I couldn't breathe because it was a rubber costume that essentially sealed me in, like being sealed in a giant condom. Uh, and so there was an air hose in the costume when I was working, um, going, and I had an earphone connected to Mike Gornick. So I was essentially working blind and deaf, and it was a little bit challenging physically, because in some of the scenes I'm standing in front of the store on a stump that was on a porch. I was like 4 feet off the ground, blind and deaf, trying to stand still like a statue.
That's one of my all-time favorite stories in Creepshow 2. It's not my top favorite, but I would say it's probably second favorite. I have to be honest, the horror movie guy here, the first, I think the best story of Creepshow 2 is the one with like the blob
Mm-hmm.
type thing in the lake.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was very, very cool, but Old Chief Wooden Head is such a classic story. It kind of reminds me of like a Steven Spielberg Amazing Stories type tale that would have been like on that show in the 80s. And it just even, even a Tales from the Dark Side, going back to Romero, kind of story, but with a just happy ending. Um, but uh, I thought Creepshow 2 is classic, and we were actually talking uh, prior, a few minutes ago, about how there's a Creepshow 2 or Creepshow museum.
Yes, somebody just told me about it in Florida, somewhere in
Florida.
Florida, a creep show museum that's being opened up.
And
Pretty
this
wild.
pretty wild. And this person wanted the old wooden chief, old chief Woodenhead, the mask, right?
He wanted the mold that was made of my head to exhibit in the museum. Um, Last year I went to a horror con in Winchester, Virginia, and there was a creep show reunion, and I met for the first time actually Tom, the man who was the hitchhiker. Uh, I'm not remembering his last name, and one of the guys on the raft. And we all did a panel discussion in front of a group, and I was really struck by it. Was very well attended, and how meaningful this film was to a lot of the people, to all the people really in the room. Um, and how much they loved the film, but also just how personally meaningful. There were two women who were adults, but they had started watching it when one was like 6 and one was 8. The 6-year-old was terrified, and they said it was this whole bonding thing, and they watched it periodically over the years together. And one of the things that people pointed out was it's a highly moral film. It's really about crime and punishment, good and evil.
I would definitely agree with that. I would go on to say that it deals with those matters in a very personal way for all the characters in the film, which I think is what makes that movie such a classic, and as well as with Creepshow 1. Creepshow 1, though, I think has a much more doesn't end on a good note kind of tone for the characters of the film. Um, but it's all I would say Creepshow 1 kind of deals more with punishing the wicked, and Creepshow 2 kind of deals more with like a just end to the people that are punished in the stories.
Yeah,
But Creepshow 2 is one of my all-time favorite horror films. So is Creepshow 1. Anything Romero works on is fantastic, and I just have to throw this out there. Sam Fish, the Fishbowl, owns George Romero's desk.
well, really, is George aware of that? Does
I
he
don't
own
think
his
he's
desk?
aware that I've tried to
You
get
do.
in contact with
How do you
him.
get into his house every time?
um, the story goes. It was the summer before I started Point Park, and I for fishbowl listeners out there, we all know that I graduated this last year, but basically I was in the market for a new desk for studying purposes, and I was working at the exchange at the time, and my mom told me that there was this low key yard sale or that was in Shadyside, and it wasn't like very well publicized, like whose house this was, and my mom ended up going like after the craze of the whole thing because it turned out to be Christine Romero's house, who she's just recently divorced George, so she was basically like selling off all his all this memorabilia, action figures, posters, T-shirts, anything that was like in the house just left over, and you have to think like that's basically like 3-4 decades of like all this stuff saved up, from various George Romero films, and one of the things she got me was George Romero's desk, and it's sitting in my room, and I'm writing my screenplays on George Romero's desk, and like we talked about, and on the Creepshow topic, that just happens to be when I'm working on developing into a series as Creepshow.
Well, good luck.
Thank you, thank you. Um, I guess one last question we could talk about, or film you worked on, was Mars Attacks as the
Yeah, your
consultant.
story was actually reminding me because the actress I worked with, Lisa Marie, was Tim Burton's girlfriend, and when they split up, she had a kind of sidewalk sale of all these things that were his, or that she had that were his, and apparently that caused a little bit of a I don't know if there was a kerfuffle with George and his ex-wife,
Right.
but I think Tim was upset that she was, unloading a bunch of stuff that he considered partially his. I don't know what the story was. I never got the gossip from her. Um, but yes, I worked with Lisa Marie, who was the only living actress, live person used as a Martian, and that the rest were all CGI. And so again, an interesting issue. How would one animate? Um, uh, we know what the creature looked like because the Martians were based on that card collecting card series,
Right.
and so we went to the zoo first, and we went to the um, L.A. Zoo, and um, in Echo Park. I think it's in Echo Park near it, where so many of the silent films, a lot of Charlie Chaplin films are filmed. They would just go out to Echo Park and you know be running around the trees and throwing each other in the lake and things. Um, and she found an amphibian, a lizard, uh, that we use sort of as a model of the movement because the difference, of course, between and the fascination of watching creatures like lizards, or even a squirrel for that matter, the, the way is it the way they freeze sometimes when they're hunting or when they're afraid they're going to be hunted, and especially with reptiles or with lizards, that deadly stillness, because stillness is doesn't really happen to human beings unless they're dead. And I've learned to simulate it for the things I do in my stage shows, and so I'm learning mime. That's a standard part of learning the basic body control, but it's not natural to be still. Um, and so that stillness, we worked for many hours to give her that sense of having that kind of one thing at a time moves in her body, so that like when she pulls her head off, there's this sort of side to side movement that she does with her head first, and then of course the animation takes over and it reveals her. She turns from the Barbie doll on steroids to the Martian in the one scene. But the movement was essentially my movement that I trained Lisa to do, and she did very well. Also, the walk, we wanted to have that unearthly sense of that she's just gliding along rather than moving in the clunky way that we move. When I do workshops with people or teach them, sometimes I'll just have people walk along and say, just walk as quietly as you can. And then I'll say, notice that you're actually crashing down every time your foot lands. Even if you try to disguise it, like a ballet dancer by landing with your toe first, you can feel the vibration in your skull every time you land because it's a great shock. What we're doing when we're walking is really falling and catching ourselves again, but so smoothly that we give ourselves this nice illusion that we're all just gliding along like these Martians. But you look at somebody carefully and you see the shock that walking represents. It's falling and catching, crash, bang, bang. You feel the vibration all through your body. So we worked on those things to give her that otherworldly look.
I have to say, Mars Attacks is one of my top favorite Tim Burton movies. But that scene specifically, especially with Martin Short, who is, one of the greatest comedians to ever, present himself on the big screen, and has gone on to create such, like his alter ego persona as Jiminy Glick, and a number of other classic films. I mean, Captain Ron's one of my top favorite,
And he
but
was funny all the time. He
he's
was funny
funny.
between takes too. He
Yeah,
was just really keeping everybody laughing.
yeah. I mean, Martin Short's like hysterical. Like he's one of those comedians, and just like you said, like he's always in, always is funny, and what just a talented guy, and his interaction with Lisa Marie in that scene is absolutely to die for, like perverted but funny at the same time. And I feel like, if they got anybody else to do it, they could not have pulled it off like Martin Short. Martin Short, as well as Lisa Marie, like made that scene, and in a lot of ways made that aspect of the movie, because it was, an all-star cast, and everybody kind of had their part in it, whether they died, early on or towards the end, and or whether they made it through the whole thing. But Mars Attacks also, I thought, this is my own personal opinion, but in a lot of ways, I think maybe you can confirm this for me, but Mars Attacks kind of has that same feel as like Doctor Strangelove, and there's a lot of moments in Mars Attacks with like the war room and everything that just kind of, at least to me, kind of seems like it's somewhat of like a throwback or a tribute to, Doctor Strangelove.
Well, I saw Doctor Strangelove when it came out, and it was such like a dash of a bucket of cold water in the face because everybody was afraid.
Right.
I mean, the Cold War was at its height, and everybody was, I remember I used to live on a flight path of the airport, and I used to just every night going to sleep thinking that that sound was the sound of the bomb dropping. Not that I was going to hear a bomb dropping, but to a kid, it was we were all afraid, and suddenly to have this stuff satirized so brilliantly, the way it was done in that movie, and that memorable final image with Chill Wills, riding the bomb down,
Right.
and like he's riding a Bronco and waving his hat. And Sterling Hayden, the amazing performance of Peter Sellers in three different roles.
Right.
You know, um, that was fantastic. So you can tell your readers about this. We're sitting at a table, and I've got these two silver dollars. And Sam, you can tell them how I've taken the one silver dollar and passed it through the table like that, so it jumps to the other side. You can tell them about that, and you know that you're a good interviewer, and you remind me in a certain way of the great Terry Gross of NPR, who has a show called Fresh Air. So if you get tired of the fishbowl thing, I think you should do one called Fresh Fish.
I will. That'll be the next interview. It'll be Fresh Fish.
It's inevitable. You're gonna triumph. You're gonna conquer.
Thank you. Thank you. Dan Kamin said it himself. The fishbowl is going to conquer and achieve. Awesome. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Dan, I'd like to thank you once again for coming to swim in the bowl with me. It was a pleasure having you on the show and getting to talk with you once again.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me. Nice talking with you.
Absolutely.